Thank you for all the presentations and for your presence here. Firstly, I'd like to make a caveat. I'm not an architect or a building engineer, and I'm going to talk about designs and building. But I think I come to this from the perspective of an educator who is very much concerned with how we can help our students learn. And actually, a lot of this sprang from my work on school libraries and on reading. So how I'm going to divide this talk up is, in the first part, I'm going to talk about my research on school libraries. And from there, I'm going to talk about design in educational spaces. And hopefully, it'll spark some thoughts for us to think about how we can rethink our educational spaces to encourage innovation. Okay, so actually my initial project, which I was looking at, was a school-wide study on the reading practices of students in a co-educational government school. Now, the school had a pretty vibrant reading program going on, and they wanted me to evaluate whether the reading program was going well or not. And I wanted to find out more about how students read and what they were reading. And in the course of the study, I realized that there was a real problem. Now, the library is typically seen as a place for reading. You know, when you think about the library, you think, oh, the library is a place for reading. But when we began the study, we realized, well, actually halfway through the studies, we realized the students were not using the school library. In fact, the school library was seldom occupied by the students who would walk past it. It was placed in quite a prominent position, but they would still walk past it and they would not use the school library. So the problem that we began with, and if you think about it, design begins with a problem, is why are the students not using the library for reading and learning? So because of that, we kind of did more observations. And if you look at this sort of imaginary schedule of what happened in the school library, it's put together from a series of observations. So in the morning, when classes are going on, the library is empty except for the librarian who is busy sorting out the books for the compulsory reading program. It is mandatory for students who do not have class to report to the library. We know that happens. They usually do their work or chat with each other. Quite often, teachers bring their students to the library to work, often on written tasks requiring the use of a laptop. Interestingly, and later you'll see how the space is set up, the students were really going to the library to finish essays. So they were not going to the library to do research. They were not using the laptops to go online to look for more information to help them with their work. So during recess, most students go to the canteen or stay in the classroom. Typically, no more than 10 students visit the library during this period. Some read, some do their work, some chat. I observed 2 or 3 students browsing and or checking out some books. Those who are chatting tend to move out of sight, you know, to the corner with the sofas because they don't want the librarian to come over and tell them to shh, keep quiet. So that's sort of our image of what a library should be like. And, you know, librarians have the idea that the library needs to be a quiet place. So when you're in the library, please keep quiet. Afternoon, after school, the library is usually quiet except for a few students who have either chosen to stay back at the library to work or have been made to stay back for detention. 3 days out of 5 in the 2 weeks that I observed, the library may be closed to students. I observed the library being closed for a staff meeting, once to host foreign visitors, another time, and to hold a briefings for students. So what does this tell us about the use of the space? It was not being prioritized as space for the students. So again, in line with design thinking, I decided to ask the users, the students, so what do you think of the library? Why don't you guys use the library? First, this is from Edward. He's an avid reader. No one goes in and out of the library. There's nothing there. What do you mean there's nothing there? There are books inside the library, aren't there? It's boring. But what is interesting here is his perception that the library is an uninteresting place. Nothing is happening. You know, the traffic that goes in and out. You only go to the library if you have detention. I never go to the library. So the library is being portrayed in this case as a negative space because of the way in which it was being used by the teachers, who probably did not think about it that way. But the students sort of thought, well, you know, I will never be identified as somebody who's a bad kid, so I'm not going to the library. If I'm free, I prefer to go to the entertainment room. It's beside the canteen. So there are alternative spaces that are more attractive to students. I think in line with what Long Kai was talking about just now, very often students are driven to use a particular space or do a particular thing because of their interest. And because the library was not interesting, the library did not appeal to them, there was no reason for them to go into the library. So here's a picture, some pictures of the library. If you look at the picture on the your extreme left, you'll see that there is a typical sofa beside the magazine section, just one sitting section. Students seldom sit here to read the magazines, which are not at all well thumbed through. They often sit there to chat. Table arrangements, you can see, it's very untypical. It is set in a circle. Sometimes it's shifted around. And the reason why it's set up this way is teachers often use the space as an air-conditioned classroom. And then, they come in and then they sit around and you've got the 30 to 40 kids sitting around the table. Now, what schools pump their money into is what they find most important. So here you can see the careers corner is actually the most well done. And the school has a very strong careers program where they really counsel the kids and direct them into places that they should go. So you can see from this that the careers corner is the most important section of the library. Okay, so moving from this, I think one of the things about design is that we need to rethink, think out of the box and think about what actually is the problem. You see, when I asked the HOD, why were people not using the library? She's like, I don't know why the students don't use the library. The principal says she's going to close down the library if the students don't use it. Now, no, she didn't. Okay, but it's just a, exaggeration. But you see, implicit in that is the student is the problem. Okay, and very often we assume that the student is the problem. But if we think about the student as a user of the space, and we think about this educational space as a problem, then we look to a different thing to think about how to resolve our problem. So the question that I have today is, how can we redesign educational space to encourage the kinds of 21st century learning dispositions desired? And it's a fundamental question that we want to engage with when we think about our school spaces. So moving from this to thinking about design, and I'll still be talking about the library, using it as an example. Firstly, what is design? Okay, design is an activity that translates an idea into a blueprint for something useful. So what you need to do here is translation. Okay, so you may have a good idea or you may have a good principle, but how do you translate it into something useful? I renovated my house recently. I wanted lots of storage space, so I had to have a blueprint for building storage space. And that was useful because then I could store things, right? So the key thing is you want a blueprint for something useful. In the Singapore Design Council's webpage, where they talk about design, you notice that most of the reasons for designs tend to be quite economic, transform products, business services, and experiences to enhance business competitiveness. Operational efficiency to be improved, add value to business, relevant to changing markets. But I think the most important one for me as an educator is that design, by putting users as the focus of consideration, actually helps to improve lives. And I put this picture of Steve Jobs here because, I think he's the epitome of design in the sense that, design is when somebody thinks about something like putting a camera and a phone together and something that you would have never thought you needed, and then making you realize it is something that you actually need. So, it's about seeing something, seeing value in something, and part of it is also about the translation of the message to the people who are using that. So what is it about design and educational space? I think the key thing about design and educational space in this quote by Groversners and Burke from the UK, they look at the history of school buildings in the UK in this book called School. And the thing that they point out here is such factors as the design of school furniture can be seen to reflect pervasive notions of pedagogy, but also to promote ideas and theories about the relationship between pupil and teacher and between body and mind in learning. Essentially, how we arrange our space tells us something about our educational values, what we believe in, what we think are important. In this particular format where I'm standing here, there is the idea that I'm imparting some form of knowledge to all of you who are sitting down there, with your table scribbling notes. Okay, not scribbling notes now, but there's that sense that because the space has been organized in this particular way, knowledge will be transmitted in a particular way. In the Singapore context, and this comes from a 1981 report to UNESCO, our classrooms are designed based on particular pedagogical principles. If you look at the underlined section, it says that as teaching methods of the conventional or traditional style, that is the teacher-centric approach, are prevalent in Singapore schools, and as a progressive or non-formal style of teaching have yet to prove their superiority, the design of classrooms closely follow the traditional model, which is sort of chairs in a row with the blackboard in front. What have changed, of course, is we may have whiteboards and smart boards in front. We have, of course, inserted technology into our teaching, but there is a question of how much has this technology changed the way we view our learning? Interestingly, in my teaching career, I first started teaching at RGS in 2000, and I was quite stunned when I went to RGS because the classrooms that I went to had these round tables. And why should round tables be different from tables that are set in a row? I think the main thing that the round tables communicated to me as a teacher and to the students was that discussion is important, collaboration is important, and I needed to work that into the classroom. So I think an important thing to note here is that educational space needs to fit in with the pedagogical designs, pedagogical ideals that we have, and the kinds of learning that we envisage taking place. So take this as sort of a thought experiment about what I think is good educational design. It is not set in stone, it's just some of my preliminary thoughts. Okay, firstly, good design must be functional. Secondly, good design must be equitable. And thirdly, good design requires mindset changes. So firstly, good design must be functional. And I'll use the school library as an example. So I've been researching about school libraries since that project on reading. And one of the things that I've discovered in looking at school libraries across the world, as well as looking at literature and research on school library, is that essentially when you talk about the 21st century school library, it encourages certain kinds of dispositions and as such requires certain kinds of spaces. So if you look at the column, the circle, the outer circle, it has the words reading, research, collaboration, study, doing. So these are 5 things that the school library, or 5 kinds of spaces that the school library can be. Okay, I'm not saying that every school library needs to have that space, but certainly if we want to promote these kinds of learning in the school library, then we need to think about how these spaces work. So for example, library as a study space. Okay, so that's an international school in Germany, and you can see the carols by the side. They remind you of the university carols, right? Where if you really want to study and you don't want to talk to your friends and you don't want to be disturbed, you kind of go and hide in a corner and do your work. Commonwealth Secondary School is recently renovating its library. It's not completed yet, but you can see that sense of a quiet nook for studying. You can hide there and do your work. If you think about the library as a collaborative space, maybe what you want to do is think about having tables where students can sit around, right? Things like noise, or we don't typically think about this, but things like working with the noise levels in the library is important because if it's a collaborative place, it is not a quiet place. Interestingly, at the Singapore American School, obviously they have a very large space for their library, but what they've done is they've divided their library into a quiet space and a noisy space. And this section that you see here is the noisy space. And there are these tables and students of varying heights for students' preferences. And they can actually sit at these places and they're allowed to be noisy here. Okay, whereas there's another quiet space which is for studying. If we think about the library as a research space, then, do we have the equipment in the library to encourage students to come in to do their research, to go online to search? I think in a day and age where students have the smartphones, we need to think about issues of access, right? Are they allowed to use these in the library? That's another issue. Another thing that needs to be taken into account is training. I think currently, at least at our secondary school libraries, we don't think about training students to do research. But the second image there is of the National Library Board. They've been very proactive with their SURE workshops, teaching students to do research, information literacy skills. There's the sense that, you may have a space for something, but you need to educate people on how to use the space and how to do the sort of learning that you encourage them to have. Okay, library as a reading space. This is a very interesting thing. If you look at the first picture at the Robin Hood School, the Robin Hood Foundation is a foundation in the US, and basically what they have done is that they've done out more than 100 schools in the US. These are low achieving schools in poor areas, so low socioeconomic status areas, and they believe that libraries can make a difference. So they've completely done up the libraries. And you can see that in that picture, there are a lot of spaces for reading. And in a recent workshop for teachers, we were sort of brainstorming, and we said, yeah, we really want more students to sit down and read. What can we do? And we realized that the cheap solution was really just to have more couches and more sitting spaces around the library. Quite typically, that single couch, in the library is what we see. I see some people laughing because they identify, I guess. Libraries as spaces for doing, we have the idea of maker spaces, right? So one maker space, technology is involved, but doing doesn't just involve maker spaces. This is a CSI activity at Singapore American School. The idea is you have learning activities in the library. It can be craft, it can be cooking, but it's not just a place for books and words. You do other things in the library and you see how information fits in. So essentially, you can see how, the idea you have of a particular place, the function you see, should they take the educational, how you design the space to encourage these forms of learning. The second thing that I want to put across is that good design must be equitable. I think Michael brought up the point just now that, just because something is designed or something is innovative doesn't necessarily mean it's universally good. So again, in my work on school libraries, if you look at the map over here, it's a map of Singapore, and these are all the public and national libraries that are in Singapore. And we know for a fact that we have one of the best public libraries in the world, and that it is very accessible to get to a library. Okay, but if you think about it from an equity angle, that's my daughter, and those are piles of books there were given by a friend who received the books from another friend, and her daughter no longer needs it. But the idea is my daughter comes from a background where she has a lot of books at home. I'm a teacher, obviously, and I bring her to the library and she accesses the library. In my personal capacity, my husband and I, we work with certain families, and the cost of taking a bus from Owen Road, for example, for this mother, unemployed mother, single mother who's living in a one-room flat in Owen Road, it costs $130 for her to take the bus from Owen Road to Toa Payoh Library. Nothing to us, I just drive down to the Bishan Library, but that $130 means something to them. So in a sense, the reason why my work focuses on school libraries is because I think, yes, we have great public libraries, we want to make it accessible. But if we really want to reach everyone, we need to work with school libraries so that these students who come from low-income homes have more, are able to sort of access the libraries. David Harvey in Social Justice and the City talks about just distribution of resources, requiring institutional, organizational, political, and economic sort of mechanisms to ensure that those who are least advantaged have as great a possibility as they possibly can get. Now, this means that when we talk about opportunity, we're not talking about equal opportunity. We're talking about equitable opportunity. Okay, because obviously, if you look at the libraries, everybody who has legs and who has a bus card can get to the library. There's equal opportunity for everybody. But when you talk about equitable opportunity, you bring in the social, and you think about, well, are these students able to actually access, in relative terms, the library from a young age and books? Which is why I think, in a sense, we need to pay more attention to certain educational spaces. It may not be just library spaces. My work is in library spaces, okay? But from what I have found, and I feel that there is insufficient information for library design in schools. If you look at this 1981 design, basically case study for UNESCO again, pretty much what is written is, the minimum recommended standard is aimed at the provision of books. It's 5 titles per secondary school student and 2 titles. It's increased since then, okay? But that's basically all that is said about the library. No other instructions, okay? 2001 Architecture of Learning about Singapore schools. This one paragraph, Media Resource Library has assumed greater importance since 1997 reappraisal of pedagogy in Singapore schools, and the radical increase in the number of computers is reflected in the increased area of this facility and the enhanced equipment. So very often when we think about space, we think about it in terms of equipment. So we rename the library MRL and we put computer equipment inside. But how is the space actually being utilized by students? And that's something we need to think about when we want to think about innovative spaces and innovative learning. Finally, the third point, good design requires mindset shifts. This is an open concept school. Open concept schools were the big thing in the 1960s and 1970s in the UK and US. They were an experiment that failed. It's being revived in some schools now, and I'm not for or against open concept schools. But the thing about open concept schools is essentially the idea that we don't really have classrooms and there can be sort of the inter-classroom mingling going on. But teachers that were using the space were complaining, volume, you can't hear, you can't teach, learning can't take place when this happens. So I think what we learn from this is that the people who are using the space, they need to be convinced of its use. That's one. Number two also is the idea that, maybe architects are very good at design, but, we use the space for a particular pedagogical purpose. So spaces, educational spaces need to be designed in such a way that they are pedagogically and locally sound. Okay, what do I mean by locally sound? Locally sound within the Singapore context, but within your own school context, it needs to fit the kinds of learning that you want to emphasize. So for example, if you have a school that is emphasizing on environmental science, nature is the big thing, then what is your local redesign of educational space to encourage these forms of learning? If your emphasis is on coding, technology, again, what is your emphasis? Looking at the entire school and all the spaces. Well, this is the Cyber Learning Center at Raffles Girls' School. It was there when I first started teaching in 2000. And I wanted to bring up this space because I think it was a very innovative space for its time. We had these round tables. Each table had a computer, which could be linked to about 6 screens. I don't remember the exact number around the room. And you could project different things, students' work. We had teleconferences with students from other countries. But on thinking back, now that I'm working on research in school libraries, what I realized is the reason why I used that room was because I had dedicated manpower. There was this technician, his name is Hock Heng. I remember him fondly because I went to him so many times for my IT issues. But he was dedicated to the room. We had other IT people, but his job was to stay in the room and help us to manage whatever we wanted to do. So I would design a lesson plan that required the use of all these technology that I was not familiar with. I would go to Hock Heng and he would help me to make it happen. Translating this to the work in school libraries, we need to think about manpower as well. It's not just about making the educational space work, putting a lot of money into redesigning space, but it's also about thinking about what sort of manpower needs we need to support what's going on. And the point is he was there, so I didn't need to go look for him anywhere. Imagine for students, I think in maker spaces, there's also the idea that you have one person there who's able to assist the students. So again, here, the idea that the group's collective experience acts as a limitation on its capacity to imagine a different educational future. In this sense, each school site is a compound of imagination, reaction, sedimentation, or radical intervention in education. The way that we think about our space is the way we think about ourselves and our students and the way that learning should happen. And I think essentially, from this presentation, I guess if there are any things that I want you to take away, it's just this idea that when we think about educational space, we want to think about the pedagogical aims of that space and the learning aims of that space, and provide the manpower training required to enable such things to happen. Thank you.